I'm ashamed to say, it's only my second visit to Cardiff, and the first time I came was actually for my interview to the planning school here. And I was quite late because I came on a train from Chester, which took about 5 hours. And it was a direct train, and it went all the way through the middle of Wales. So I was quite late, and I remember running to the planning school and had my interview, got offered a place, but I had two choices, this and Newcastle. So it was a tough choice, but I went to Newcastle. So you know, it's good to come back. But at TfL, we have quite a strong relationship with Cardiff University through our students. So we have a programme of sandwich placements from the town planning students at a variety of schools across the UK, and they work in our planning team doing a variety of roles. So we tend to have about 5 a year, and we've got 3 from Cardiff at the moment. We've got 2 coming in the summer who are sitting in the back row. No pressure to perform, and it's a really good experience for us and hopefully for them as well. It keeps us in touch with students and what they're learning and the whole academic side of planning, but also it introduces them in a very interesting year, we hope, to the world of work and transport in London. So it's great to be back in Cardiff, and what I wanted to talk about this evening was some of the issues that are facing London in terms of transport and how we are planning to deal with that. So just to set the scene about Transport for London and what our purpose in life is, for those that aren't familiar, it is to keep London working and growing and make life in London better. So it's very much focused on the role that transport can play in terms of contributing to the life of a city rather than transport for its own means. So it's about the role of transport in helping to make London a better place. We have to meet the rising expectations of our customers and users. We have to plan ahead to meet the challenges of a growing population, and we have to help unlock economic development and growth, and I'll talk more about those in the presentation. In terms of how we're organised, couldn't be a presentation on TfL without a picture of the Mayor. So we are one of the Mayor's accountable bodies. So the Mayor of London, currently Boris Johnson, is elected, and the Mayor is responsible for a number of functional bodies in London, one of which is Transport for London. So we are responsible to the Mayor. The Mayor chairs our board, and TfL as an organisation is responsible for operating most of the transport network that you will see in London. The only exception is chunks of the National Rail network. So the intercity services like First Great Western are part of the franchise railway, and some of the suburban services that operate in London, like South West Trains, Southern, are not under our control. And that's one of the big issues that we'd like to address going forward. But the vast majority of what you see and what you use in London, whether it's the red buses, whether it's the tube, whether it's managing the process of franchising black cabs, whether it's the primary road network, the DLR, we even have a cable car in the form of the Emirates airline. So we are responsible for operating most of London's transport network, but not all of it. So just to pause for a moment on the role and the relationships between transport and a growing city and the economy of a city, because since TfL was formed in 2000, we've been through a number of different cycles with the organisation in terms of our priorities. When we were first formed, our main priority was to deal with the lack of investment in the existing network. So bringing the tube up to scratch and making sure the assets that we had were fit for purpose and were doing the job that we needed them to do. At that time, London's population wasn't growing particularly fast. It was more of a steady state situation and dealing with the legacy of what we'd inherited and how we sort it out. Since then, it's been a very significant change in terms of population growth and the recognition that transport can play a significant role in supporting the growth of a city and driving the economy. Now, there's a big debate going on in the UK nationally at the moment about devolution, about cities, about productivity, about powers, and all those sorts of things. And we have elements of that working quite well in London, and I'll talk more about that at the end of the presentation. But just to summarise, transport of people, goods and services makes cities work. Cities drive national productivity. So the relationship between transport in cities and a national economy is really, really strong. And connecting housing to jobs, opening up new opportunities, broadening and deepening the labour market to drive economic prosperity locally and nationally. And transport contributes to all of those elements. With greater connectivity from transport, people's horizons expand, their incomes rise, and business prospers. And we believe what's good for London is good for the UK. a strong London with a growing economy has really positive benefits for the rest of the UK. The final point's about housing, and there's been a big shift in our priorities over the last, I would even say the last 3 years. Our main focus over the sort of the early 2000s to say 2010 was about supporting the economy, economic growth, jobs. Now there's been a big shift towards the housing crisis, often referred to in London, and the lack of affordable housing, and the lack of housing supply generally, and the realisation that transport can play a major role in helping to bring forward housing and helping to increase the supply, to reduce the prices and make housing more affordable. So a big part of our focus now is looking at how we can use transport to increase the supply of housing in London, and I'll come back to that later on in the presentation. So in terms of what we do, a few statistics here. We have more than 30 million journeys on our road and public transport networks every day. And since 2000, which is when TfL was created, the public transport mode share for London overall, when you look at the total number of trips, has increased by just under 11%. So we've seen a reduction in the proportion of people driving and an increase in the proportion of people using public transport, walking and cycling. And that's a trend we haven't seen elsewhere in the UK. We're delivering one of the world's largest programs of transport capital investment. We still have major legacy issues in terms of dealing with a lack of investment in the tube network. If you come to London at the moment at the weekends, you might experience major closures as we continue to upgrade those tube lines. But also we're building new capacity in the form of Crossrail. We directly manage the strategic road network in London. We're responsible for all the traffic lights, which is a real pain in the bum. And we control the flow on all of the major roads into the city. We regulate taxis and we operate the congestion charge and the low emission zone as well. So just in terms of some statistics there on the left, you can see that the number of journeys made in the year 2013-14, 3.65 billion trips by road, 2.4 billion by bus, 1.3 billion by underground, and it goes on. The other challenge that we have in London is the differences within London. London is not a single entity in terms of how people behave. People behave very differently in terms of how they travel in inner London than outer London. Outer London has far much more in common with the rest of the UK than inner and central London, and that creates its own challenges that we're dealing with. So how far have we come? In terms of the passengers on our services, in the top left table, just looking back over the last 5 years, we've seen a major increase in all of our public transport modes. On the bus network, through the introduction of the Oyster card in particular, which makes it easier for people to travel generally, and contactless payments if people have used that in London, using your bank card to tap in and out rather than having an Oyster card in the first place. So it's much easier now to use public transport than it used to be, and that's driving ridership. We've also invested heavily in the bus network. We're very fortunate in London. We still have a regulated system, so we can plan the bus services to complement what we have on the rail network. We don't have the same situation you have in other regional cities where you have different bus operators competing for the most lucrative routes and not operating on the other routes that don't generate enough money. So we can regulate and can plan the whole of the network in totality, so we're very fortunate we have that. We've seen a major increase in the tube network. Almost every month we exceed the previous busiest month ever on the tube network, with more and more people using the tube. It's partly because driving in London is not a pleasurable experience, and it's generally easier to use public transport. But also Oyster card and the investment we've made in the tube network makes it more attractive for people to use it. Big increase in the DLR in particular, with growth around Canary Wharf and the regeneration that's happening out towards the east around the Olympic Park as well. And one of the big success stories we've had is, and this is where there are probably some parallels with what you have in Cardiff around the National Rail network, that since we took control of the London Overground network, which used to be part of the National Rail network, used to be a commuter service franchised by the government, and it's solely contained within London, so it performs a very local service around North and South London in particular. Since TfL took control of that, invested in it, upgraded the stations, replaced the rolling stock, integrated it with Oyster, ran more trains at weekends in the evenings, we've seen a massive increase in usage on the Overground network through the investment that we've made. So I think it's a really good case study, because the Overground network is quite a small part of the National Rail network, but it demonstrates what you can do if you've got local control and influence over what you need. We've also seen an improvement in reliability, and hopefully people who come to London now will experience that. We no longer have the Evening Standard headlines about the misery line and things like that. We've seen a major increase in particular on the underground reliability. Our biggest challenge, to be honest, is about the road network with the level of congestion and how that impacts on bus services, and that's remained stable. But the big success story has been the improvement in reliability on the underground, and that's reflected in the customer satisfaction. So we've been in a very fortunate position, and we're very aware of that in London, that we've had security of long-term funding. We've been given powers and devolved powers through the mayor, and we have some regulatory controls that don't exist elsewhere in the country. But also we have a huge task to do in terms of the volume of people that we're moving every day. The most interesting thing that's happened, I think, is the change in how people travel in London and the change that's occurred over the last 20 years. This graph goes back to 1993, and the overall bar is the total number of trips per day. So you can see that it starts off around 23 million, rising to over 30 million, and the different colours represent the mode of transport used. And the big success story by far in London is the increase in public transport in blue. Actually, it's a reduction in car use in red, and the increase in walking, but particularly cycling. So small numbers, but very significant proportional increases in cycling. But the big trend has been the mode shift away from car, which has been the sort of policy kind of that we've had in London and had in the UK for the last 20 years. And it's worked in London because we've managed to control all the levers that we've needed to control. We've restricted car use through the congestion charge. The level of congestion is a natural deterrent for people to drive anyway, but we've managed to entice people to use public transport through Oyster and improved services, and that works. So just looking in more detail at that, again, this is going back to 2001, so more recent data, and you can see there the black line is the population increase. So we've seen a steady increase in population, and the major increase there in bus in red, rail in green, underground in blue, and the reduction in car. So I think if TfL could be proud of anything it's done over the last 15 to 20 years, it's the mode shift towards public transport. In terms of how TfL is funded, it's a complex picture. This is a simple diagram. So we have a total income of £11 billion, which will sound like an awful lot of money, but when you look at the totality of what we have to do, it's a relatively small amount per person moved. 42% of that comes from fares, so nearly half of it comes from the fare payer. So if you think fares are high in London, it's actually paying to operate and invest in the transport network. 17% is grants from the government, 8% is specifically for Crossrail, 6% we generate ourselves from the congestion charge and commercial development, 20% we borrow and we pay back from future fares. So TfL has borrowing capability against future fare income, and 7% is from business rates that are devolved to the mayor and retained in London. So this is showing some of the sort of devolution elements that have been given to the mayor over recent years. So where the money is spent, very simply, we spend 34% of that 11 billion on investment and 66% on running the service. Everything is spent, there's no retained profit. We're a not-for-profit organisation. And depending on how much investment we're doing, the dial will move around accordingly. So in terms of the challenges for the future, our biggest challenge by far is population growth. So today the population of London is just over 8.6 million. That's the largest it's ever been. So it surpassed its previous 1939 peak. So the trend we'll see in a moment was the population was falling, like many regional cities in the UK, and it's been rising steadily over the last 10 years. By 2030, it will be 10 million, and we're fairly certain that will happen. That's based on births of people who are living in London now. And by 2050, it'll be anywhere between 12, 13 million. So there's a few strap lines there that we love. So it's 6 new residents every hour, a carload every 40 minutes, 2 buses every day, 2 tube trains every week. And when you look at that graph, you can see this graph goes back to the 1800s, and you can see through the Industrial Revolution how population, and this will be reflected in all cities, this will be the same trend in Cardiff but with different numbers, how population increased through that period. Then in that post-war period, through a combination of things, whether it was the New Towns programme, whether it was the depopulation of cities, the population started to fall. And then something strange happened in the sort of early 1990s, that people stopped leaving London and people decided to stay, and then more people started to stay, and the population has increased ever since. So the range that we are forecasting for 2050 is anywhere between 9.5 and 13.5 million. And that's a huge step change from where we are now in terms of the number of people that we have to move. And it means a different model for London. It means London can't exist in the way it does now if we're dealing with that size of population. When you look at the distribution of that population, and this is just taking the 10 million figure, which is a more certain one, so that's our statutory planning horizon to 2030. On the left, it's the population, with the deeper red is the greater increase in population. And employment, again, we're forecasting an extra 600,000 jobs in London over that period. And again, the deeper the colour, the greater the concentration of jobs. You can see that population isn't dispersed evenly over the city, it's concentrated in particular areas. We have big concentrations to the east, where the largest amount of brownfield land is, so the former Dockland areas, the Olympic Park, where a lot of that housing growth will take place. But we've also got housing intensification in existing urban areas, existing town centres, and parts of outer London. And they create some of the biggest challenges for us in transport, because the step change from where we are now is the largest jump. And it means that people who, in outer London at the moment, might drive more, because they behave more like the rest of the UK in terms of patterns of travel. In the future, with this level of population increase, if people continue to drive as much in outer London as they do today, we will have a massive congestion problem. So we need to kind of plan to avoid that situation. The other trend that we're seeing is a concentration of employment in central London, and I'll come back to that. And one of the biggest discussion points we always have as planners in London is the whole idea of dispersed employment. Wouldn't it be better if people worked closer to home and they didn't have to commute so much into the central area? And the big challenge that we have in London is that what makes London attractive for jobs is the central area. It's what we call the agglomeration effect. It's the attractiveness of those industries being clustered together just attracts more jobs on top of them. So the idea that you can sort of move clusters of employment from central London to Croydon just doesn't work economically. So what we have to accept is if London is to grow and we're to grow jobs, and these are the jobs that will are mobile around the world, then we need to create a central London where those jobs can thrive. And that does mean that we need to be capable of moving more people in and out of central London, which puts more pressure on our rail networks. When we look at some of those growth areas where we've got the greatest potential for intensification of homes and jobs, we call them opportunity areas and areas of intensification. You can see there on the map of London, they're clustered across the whole of the city, but there's a big chunk around kind of East London. So one of the challenges that we have is some of these areas have actually got very little transport at the moment. They're very large ex-industrial sites, they're contaminated land. Out here you've got elements of kind of floodplain, and this has got some of the greatest potential for the largest amount of housing. So if our primary objective, and the Mayor's primary objective, is to unlock as much housing as possible, then this is probably the best place to look. But some of the transport challenges about getting the right transport networks in place to support that are quite large. And then when we look across the year, we're forecasting billions more trips on public transport and roads. So by 2030, 11 billion annual trips in 2030, compared to where we are now, just over 9.5 billion. So that is our biggest challenge that we have to deal with. But just go back to that economic point, and why is growth such a good thing? One, we can't do anything about the growth, it's happening anyway, so it's our responsibility to plan for it. But one of the success factors of London is it does remain extremely competitive globally. It's a place where people continue to want to invest, and we're attracting industries and investment to the UK who hopefully will start in London and then move to the rest of the UK from that point onwards. It's about agglomeration. People are attracted to central London because they want to cluster with other industries like them, particularly those service sectors, and we need to support that by retaining and improving the amount of transport capacity we've got to support the growth of central London. Now, to make sure that we have a plan for that, we do look long term, and we have to because of the scale of the challenge that we've got. We have a statutory planning sort of process that takes us to 2030. So we still have regional planning in London. So the Mayor is actually a regional planning authority. So we have the 33 boroughs that produce their own borough plans, but the Mayor is responsible for producing the London plan, which looks across all 33 boroughs. So we still have regional planning, and we need it because of the scale of growth that we've got. Our responsibility is to produce the Mayor's transport strategy that works with the London plan to show how the transport network needs to adapt to support the growth. And we've recently produced a London Infrastructure Plan 2050, which is out for consultation, which is looking longer term and looking at the scale of infrastructure that we need to support London's growth by 2050. Not just transport, but communications, utilities, all of the infrastructure that we need to support a bigger city. This is just to illustrate the point about agglomeration and some of the different scenarios that we've started to test in terms of growth and how that impacts on different forms of transport. So looking at the central activities zone, as we call central London, which is where the agglomeration of high-value jobs wants to take place, that's mainly supported by rail capacity, moving large volumes of people in the morning, taking them out in the evening to support jobs in the central area. Quite inefficient. It'd be better if people work closer to home, but the economic model doesn't support that. If the jobs aren't in central London, they'll be somewhere else in the world. So we need to support that. This Mayor wants us to support that by investing in the transport network. We've got options around how we do that. Intensify the existing central area, building higher. There's challenges around that. Expanding the central area beyond its current boundaries into areas around it. And you see that if you come into Paddington, you'll see Paddington Basin, which is an extension of the central activity zone, the same at King's Cross. You'll see the same happening at Waterloo, London Bridge with the Shard. And we've also looked at whether satellite activity zones, whether it's Stratford, Canary Wharf, Old Oak Common, can become major economic centres to take some of the growth of central London. And we think this model will work. Housing is an even bigger challenge because of the scale of population growth and the number of homes that we need to accommodate. When you look at the existing policy, it's about an infill of brownfield sites. You run out of brownfield sites quite soon, and then you need to look at the existing areas of London that are developed. You need to look at town centres, and you need to look at the edge of London as well. If you focused on those areas that have got very high levels of public transport accessibility and clustered population growth around there to drive the right travel behaviour, that would lead you to one set of circumstances. And then if you looked at town centres in outer London and thought about a radical replanning of those places to put large amounts of housing in those outer London centres, that would lead you to a different set of transport challenges. So all these different scenarios we are testing at the moment to look at the implications in terms of transport. What it means when we think about 10 million people, that's 1.4 million more than we've got today, and the number of housing units, it means that a number of things are going to have to substantially change in terms of densification, height, the character of places will be quite different in 2030 than we are today. The alternative is not to accommodate that housing, and if you don't do that, people will commute even further. There'll be growth outside the London boundary, pressures on the green belt. It will start to choke off the central London economy, and that's something that has quite negative consequences. So the challenge is to accommodate this growth within London's boundaries. In doing so, we have to make sure it's not just a bigger London, but a better one in terms of the quality of life. And again, one of the challenges that we face is the change in the demographic profile of the population in London over time as well. We're expecting a fourfold increase in the number of Londoners who are over 90 years old by 2050. So far more older people, but also a lot more younger people as well. A big part of this population increase is being fueled by migration over the last 20 years. A combination of people moving into London, but also people who are now choosing to stay in London and not move out. And they're all having children. So we'll have a city that's got more younger people and more older people, and some really old people. And when you think about the challenge of that in transport terms, it's got some quite obvious implications about accessibility, but also the type of expectation that people have about transport, where they want to go, the time of day they want to travel. All those things kind of factor into our thinking. But also the role of technology as well. There seems to be a lot of expectation at the moment on autonomous vehicles, driverless cars, what role they will have in the future. Will that somehow help solve London's congestion problem if all the cars were autonomous? Difficult to see how we're going to get that in one jump from here to 2030, but there could be a role for autonomous vehicles to help deal with some of the congestion we've got. We've got a huge issue with air quality in London. We've had some recent court decisions from the UK courts about the UK's non-compliance on air quality. So we are under quite serious obligations to do something about air quality in London and reduce emissions. So this could help with that, the role of electric vehicles. So there's a whole thing about what role technology can play, particularly around the road network, to help reduce congestion. But we don't think doing nothing is not an option. We still have a whole series of legacy issues that we need to deal with. That's a photograph of the switchboard at the signal control room at Earls Court. If anyone's been through Earls Court and got stuck waiting for a district line train because there's a signal failure, it's probably because one of these knobs has fallen out. Now, some of that equipment goes back to the 1920s, and the cost of upgrading it is quite significant. A signal failure at Earls Court, because of its prominent position and the number of people moving through it, cost the UK economy an estimated just over £2 million in lost productivity. People just stuck waiting. So some of this stuff just needs to be fixed. And we have investments underway to sort some of this, but not all of it. But we have a whole series of legacy issues with the tube in particular that we need to sort out. We've also got the road network. There's been very little investment in the road network in London for the past 40 years. The main focus has been on the rail network, and that's been a good decision because we've had a big modal shift towards public transport. We've got a series of assets that are coming to the end of their life. We've got a series of assets that don't contribute to the quality of life in London. We've got a series of small parts of urban motorway. We've got quite serious congestion across many parts of our urban areas and air quality issues. So we need to do something about the road network to improve, reduce congestion, improve quality of life, and deal with air quality. Some of the implications of what we've got and not addressing these problems. Bank Station is our most congested station on the underground network. It's where many of the underground lines meet in central London. It has been closed 34 times between July and October 2014. And we have to manage it on a daily basis by deploying extra staff and introducing one-way systems. Now, it's in a very prominent part of London. It's a huge interchange, but it's also feeding people into the financial district. So the implication of Bank Station having to be closed permanently has quite significant implications for London's future growth. So we have a series of critical pinch points on the network that we're still dealing with because of the legacy of the Victorian infrastructure. So we have work underway to try and secure the funding to deal with these problems over the course of the next 10 years. But there is a clear recognition that transport can directly influence homes and jobs and unlock development. And therefore, there's got to be a case, particularly in somewhere like London, where the values are so high, that you can secure contributions from that development towards funding the transport. And that's a big part of the job that we do, is trying to secure those contributions and to make the case for doing that. Some illustrations here from the Isle of Dogs, from Canary Wharf, going back over time, for those people that will remember the development of Docklands. And you can see from 1981 to 87, when the DLR was introduced, the first phase of development. 1999 with the Jubilee line, the next phase. In 2019, when Crossrail opens, you'll get the next phase again. So the development of Canary Wharf is entirely dependent on the provision of transport capacity. And without that additional capacity, you won't get those future phases, you won't get the jobs, you won't get the investment. But it does mean that Canary Wharf has to pay, which they do pay, towards the cost of that infrastructure. So it's looking at this model and how we can roll this model out more widely across London to secure funding from developers who are benefiting to help fund the investment in the first place. This is going back to some of those opportunity areas in orange where we're expecting most of the growth. And just to focus on one of those, that's a photograph of it. That's Vauxhall 9 Elms, Battersea Power Station. Just to give you a flavour of this as a particular area in a case study. So this is one of the areas where we have the opportunity to grow central London beyond its existing boundaries. There's pressure from development to develop those sites, to create new jobs, to move some of the activities from central area into the 9 Elms part of London. That can't happen at the moment. There's no transport infrastructure at all. It's an area of logistics, warehousing, New Covent Garden Market, and the development of this area as a part of central London is entirely dependent on the tube being extended. So you can see there from the map at the bottom, the proposition is to extend the Northern Line, relatively simple, 2 stops, supporting the development of 16,000 new homes, many thousands of new jobs, as part of a comprehensive redevelopment of that whole area. Some of you may recognise the power station. You may have travelled past it on the train. So the power station is now owned by a Malaysian investor. They're in the process of restoring it and refurbishing it and creating jobs and many homes and retail within the power station building itself. So the proposition is an extension of the Northern Line, 2 stations. First at 9 Elms, the second at Battersea at the power station itself. And this whole area here is part of the development area that is moving from a industrial warehousing supporting central London into being part of central London. There's also proposals for a footbridge over to Pimlico as well. The challenge has been how we fund it. So when you're dealing with a development of this scale and a significant shift away from its historic uses, you've obviously got a major land use change. There are a whole series of quite sensitive policy issues about protecting but consolidating some of those strategic industrial uses. They have a really important role to play in supporting London because they're servicing London, but we need to reorganise them to make better use of the land. A major overhaul of the public realm. We've got multiple developers. We need to try and bring them together in a coherent way so we can extract funding from them. And we've got very large infrastructure costs. We also need to make sure the infrastructure is there at the right time to support the development, so we don't get too many jobs and homes there without the tube, because that will create the wrong effect in terms of transport. And there's also a big challenge around housing in this area and getting the right kind of housing, affordable housing, and the contribution towards affordable housing being traded off towards the contributions towards transport. So when you're dealing with developers, there's a finite pot of money they've got that's available for what they would say is betterment, and often we are trading transport with affordable housing, and there has to be a better way. So the economic benefits are fairly clear. We made a strong case to Treasury. So expanding central London brings significant economic benefits. It enables more high productive jobs, generates over £5 billion to the UK economy over 60 years, and means the Northern Line extension, which is directly responsible for making that happen, has a very positive business case. But how do we fund it? So it's being funded through quite an unusual model. So it's being funded entirely by the development in the area. So all of the developers are paying for it. It costs £1 billion, so it's a huge amount of funding from the private sector. The government's provided £1 billion loan to build the NLE. So the mayor has a loan from government, and that's been secured through the European Investment Bank. The government has allowed us to create an enterprise zone, which means business rates in that area from the future jobs are ring-fenced to pay back the cost of the loan. So the loan is there to fund the transport, transport's enabling the jobs, jobs generate business rates go back to pay for the loan. So that's the mechanism that the enterprise zone has allowed us to do. So the income from the enterprise zone over 30 years is just under £2 billion. So that's more than sufficient to pay for the cost of the infrastructure, but also all the other infrastructure that's needed to support the development as well. And developer contributions through community infrastructure levy is just over 250 million, that should say, not billion. So it's increasingly the way that we need to look at how we fund our infrastructure. Because of the advantage that we've got of high land values in London, we need to have a way of extracting the value from developers to pay for the infrastructure. And the Northern Line extension is one example that works in that area. The other big challenge that we have is to get more out of the rail network that we have, particularly in South London, that's operated by the government. So most of the national rail network in South London isn't in our control. It operates to a very different level of service to the rail service that we operate. It has much lower frequencies, poorer reliability, poorer stations, and poor off-peak services. And what we want to do is to bring the standard of that up to the same standard as the underground. And we want to do that by having the powers and the control to run that part of the rail network. So that's part of our devolution ask to government, that we have greater control over the national rail network in London, so we get more capacity out of the totality of the rail network as opposed to just the bit that we control. And the main benefit of that is we can deliver more housing in South London. More capacity equals more homes. And just to finish on a couple of other big things that we are working on at the moment. Crossrail 2, so Crossrail 1 is nearing completion at the moment. For those of you that travel into Paddington, when that opens, it will transform your onward connections. It will mean you can get to other parts of London. So that's new east-west rail capacity. Because of the level of congestion and growth that we have across the whole of our rail networks, we're planning a new north-east-south-west tube line called Crossrail 2 that connects national rail lines to the north with those to the southwest through a new tunnel in the central area. And this is about supporting jobs, but also supporting the development of more homes here and here. So this has been planned to piece together some of the major growth areas, particularly to the north of London, to support the development of housing in those areas. It's a huge ask in terms of the cost. It's about £20 billion. But again, we're not asking for cash, we're asking for controls and mechanisms to generate funding from development. So our ask is about devolution, it's about London paying for its own infrastructure, but being given the mechanisms to do so. So in summary, what is the London experience? We think it's been very helpful to have a strong political lead to make a clear place for a single entity. So we think having a mayor has been a real benefit to make the case for transport in London. We have a strategic planning role with the right geographical focus. We look at the right area. So we have a regional planning kind of focus rather than focused on particular sections of a city. And that's important for travel and transport. We have a single transport authority to produce an integrated plan and prioritise spending. It means we can decide where the priorities are in terms of investment rather than government. And we have the greatest understanding of what those pressures and challenges are, being accountable to the mayor. We have a really good understanding of what's happening on the ground. So the importance of data and understanding what people are doing and what changes are happening in your city in terms of travel demand is really, really important. So one of the biggest strengths that we've had is the ability to demonstrate to government and whoever we need to make the case to that we understand what's happening on the ground about the facts, about how people are moving and the relationships between transport, economic development. We are part of the mayoralty, so the mayor has a strategic planning function, so we can actually integrate transport and land use planning, so we can look at the major areas of growth and we can prioritise our transport spend to support growth in those areas. I think in the context of a growing population and increasing demand for our services, if we didn't have this kind of organisational structure and clear political lead, we wouldn't be able to accommodate the growth that we're facing. So just to finish on a slide the work we're doing with Greater Manchester in particular. So part of the government's proposals for a northern powerhouse, we're working with Transport for Greater Manchester to help them develop what we have in London, an integrated transport authority that's relevant to their geographical circumstances, but learning from our experiences over the last 15 years to make sure that they can get something in place that works for them, but can start to deliver the benefits more quickly. So hopefully that's given you quite a comprehensive overview. It might be quite a lot of information there, and I'm happy to take any questions about any aspect of what we're doing in transport in London. And thanks for listening. Thank you.